Chhoun's life begins in a place shaped by war, trauma, and a level of human suffering that most people can only imagine from the pages of history books. Born in Cambodia in either 1972 or 1973, his earliest memories were not of toys, laughter, or childhood innocence. They were of the Khmer Rouge, a radical communist regime that plunged an entire nation into hell. For a young boy like Run, the world was already a place of terror. At only 4 years old, he was torn from his family and sent to one of the regime's notorious work camps. These camps were designed to break adults, let alone a child barely old enough to understand the concept of death. Every day he endured the weight of starvation, forced labor, and the constant threat of violence. Surrounded by mass executions, he saw bodies fall and lives extinguished with a coldness that no child should ever have to witness. In those early years, fear was not an emotion. It was a baseline condition of existence. His survival was not guaranteed. Yet somehow Run lived through those years of brutality, shaping a psyche forged in a world where empathy was scarce and mortality was omnipresent. When the Khmer Rouge finally fell and Cambodia staggered toward recovery, the scars they left carved deep into the minds of survivors. For Run and his family, the only hope for a future beyond survival lay outside the borders of their devastated homeland. Eventually, they were able to flee Cambodia, embarking on a journey that would bring them across oceans to the United States. But for many refugee families, the promise of America did not erase the trauma they carried with them. Instead, it added new challenges: poverty, displacement, and the struggle to adapt to a completely unfamiliar culture. When Run arrived in America, he found himself in a country that offered opportunity but also demanded rapid adaptation. Refugee communities often settled in neighborhoods where resources were scarce and violence was common, making assimilation even harder for children like him. School was difficult, not just because of language barriers, but because Run carried emotional wounds that no educator or social worker had the capacity to address. He did not arrive in America free from his past. He brought it with him, buried but burning. The environment he entered in the United States added another layer of instability. In cities across California, Asian immigrant youth were turning to gangs as a survival mechanism. Whether it was protection from rival groups, a sense of identity in a place where they felt invisible, or simply companionship in a hostile environment, gangs offered what many refugee families struggled to provide: an immediate sense of belonging. For Run, the tiny Rascals gang, known as TRG, became that home. At a time when he felt like he didn't belong in Cambodia or America, TRG filled the void with something that felt like family. At first, he was just another kid drawn into a world of graffiti, petty crime, and neighborhood loyalty. But TRG was not a small street clique. It was one of the largest Asian American gangs in the country, active across multiple states and notorious for robberies, shootings, and violent rivalries. In this environment, Run found something he never had: respect. His fearlessness, born from surviving atrocities in childhood, made him stand out. Many kids freeze when faced with violence. Run had already lived through horrors far worse. By his teens, he was no longer just a follower. He was rising quickly, earning a reputation for aggression, leadership, and absolute willingness to do whatever the gang required. That rise came with consequences. The deeper he went into gang life, the more violence became normalized. For Run, conflict was familiar, almost natural. Where others saw danger, he saw routine. The line between survival and domination blurred. In TRG, power came through fear, loyalty, and the ability to produce results. And Run provided results. As he grew older, his influence expanded. Members respected him, others feared him, and rival gangs recognized his name. He had transformed from a traumatized refugee child into a hardened street leader. But beneath the surface, the transformation was even more complex. Psychological studies have shown that early childhood trauma, especially sustained exposure to violence, can disrupt emotional development. Children who grow up witnessing death often struggle to understand empathy and impulse control later in life. In Run's case, the wiring of his mind had been set long before he joined a gang. The Khmer Rouge didn't just scar his childhood. They shaped the adult he would become. Violence became his language, his framework for problem-solving, and his primary method of self-assertion. Combined with a gang environment that rewarded brutality, the stage was set for the catastrophic events that would follow. By the early 1990s, Chhoun had become a significant figure within the tiny Rascals gang, deeply embedded in a world of retaliation, armed robberies, and escalating confrontations. The pressures of leadership, the search for status, and the desperate need to maintain dominance over both rivals and his own members pushed him toward decisions that would steer his life into the darkest chapter imaginable. The boy who survived genocide had grown into a man who had learned to inflict fear instead of simply endure it. And soon California would witness the full manifestation of that transformation. By the time Chhoun entered his late teens, the tiny Rascals gang was evolving from a loosely organized street group into a sprawling criminal machine. Spread across California and several other states, TRG had established itself as one of the most notorious Asian American gangs in the country, rivaling sets like the Asian Boys and other Southeast Asian groups formed from similar refugee experiences. For many gangs, hierarchy came slowly, but TRG developed rapidly, fed by the anger, trauma, and instability that many immigrant youths carried with them. In that world, power was earned through violence, reputation, and the ability to command loyalty. And Run was uniquely equipped for all of it. While many gang members struggled to navigate the psychological shift from ordinary teenager to criminal, Run adapted seamlessly. Violence didn't shock him, it barely registered as unusual. For someone who had spent his formative years surrounded by mass death and brutality, gang warfare in American suburbs felt almost familiar. That emotional numbness became one of his greatest assets. He could move through situations others found overwhelming, and he made decisions with a cold efficiency that elevated him above his peers. A gang needs leaders who are decisive, fearless, and willing to take risks. Run embodied all three. As he climbed the ranks, TRG was no longer just a place of belonging for him. It was a vehicle for authority. Younger members gravitated toward him, drawn by his confidence and willingness to act. His presence meant safety, influence, and the potential for bigger scores. Run understood that leadership required more than intimidation. It required charisma. He knew how to talk, how to recruit, how to mold young members into loyal followers. This combination of ruthlessness and charm made him dangerous long before he ever committed the crimes that would put him on death row. Outside the gang, law enforcement was growing increasingly aware of TRG's reach. Police departments up and down the West Coast recognized that this wasn't just a small ethnic gang confined to a few blocks. It was a network capable of planning coordinated robberies, orchestrating drive-by shootings, and moving stolen goods through a pipeline of associates. TRG cliques in Long Beach, San Bernardino, Sacramento, and beyond were becoming increasingly violent, and leaders like Run were at the center of that transformation. For Run, these pressures only intensified his need to assert dominance. In gang culture, leadership is always contested. Rivals target you, your own members test you, and other cliques attempt to challenge your authority. Run responded to these pressures with escalating aggression. He became known not only for committing violence himself, but for directing others to do it. His decision-making was shaped by a worldview forged in survival. Act first or be acted upon. This mentality would eventually spiral into the chain of crimes that defined his legacy. But before that spiral began, TRG's internal dynamics were shifting. The early 1990s saw an explosion of gun access among youth gangs. Semi-automatic weapons were circulating freely, and the brutality of gang confrontations increased. TRG members were no longer content with petty crimes or small-time robberies. They sought bigger targets, bigger profits, and bigger reputations. Home invasion robberies became one of the gang's preferred operations. These crimes were lucrative, unpredictable, and psychologically devastating to victims. Run's leadership placed him at the center of planning and participating in these missions. Home invasions require a specific type of mindset, one that is comfortable with chaos, intimidation, and the violation of personal space. Run excelled at them. Whether a target was chosen for supposed wealth, gang rivalry, or simply opportunity, he executed these crimes with efficiency and a sense of authority that emboldened those around him. The people who followed him did so because he seemed invincible, a leader shaped by war, hardened by the streets, and willing to take the kinds of risks that most gang members avoided. That invincibility, however, created a sense of moral detachment. The boundaries between survival and cruelty blurred. What began as criminal activity driven by desperation transformed into acts that reflected deeper psychological scars. Scholars and criminologists often point out that unresolved childhood trauma can resurface in adulthood as misplaced aggression or a need for control. For Run, the traumas of Cambodia did not fade. They resurfaced in the power he wielded over others, especially during violent encounters. The more he embraced violence as a solution, the more extreme he became. By 1995, Chhoun had become one of the most feared figures within the TRG network. His reputation extended beyond Cambodia town or Long Beach. It was known across California's gang landscape. With his growing influence came a sense of urgency, both within the gang, which relied on him for direction, and from law enforcement, which increasingly viewed him as a priority threat. Tensions between TRG and rival gangs flared. Conflicts with the Asian boys escalated. Rivalries with Laotian and Vietnamese sets grew more volatile. Every confrontation, every robbery, every moment of violence added fuel to a fire that had been burning in Run since childhood. As summer approached, the pressure reached its peak. Run found himself leading younger members through a series of increasingly daring home invasions. These operations were fast, violent, and unforgiving. The goal was money, guns, and dominance, but the cost was escalating. Each robbery was riskier than the last, and the people targeted were more vulnerable. In the eyes of his followers, Run was untouchable. But in reality, he was accelerating toward a point of no return. By mid-1995, the stage was set. The man who had escaped genocide only to become the leader of one of America's most dangerous gangs was about to initiate a wave of violence that would shock California, devastate families, and shape his legacy forever. The murders that followed were not accidents or isolated incidents. They were the culmination of years of trauma, rage, power, and a lifetime shaped by violence. By the summer of 1995, the line between survival and savagery had long vanished for Chhoun. The young man who had risen through the ranks of the tiny Rascals gang was now operating with complete disregard for human life, leading a series of home invasion robberies that would place his name among the most violent criminals in modern California history. What unfolded over the span of just a few weeks in July and August was not a series of random crimes. It was a coordinated, escalating wave of brutality driven by desperation, gang loyalty, and the psychological legacy of a life built in war. Each attack grew more reckless, more calculated, and more devastating than the last. The spree officially began with a home invasion that would leave the state reeling. The murder of 5 members of the Nguyen family in San Bernardino County. On an August night in 1995, Chhoun and several TRG members broke into what they believed was a lucrative target. But whatever they hoped to gain inside that house was overshadowed immediately by the horror they unleashed. The crime was merciless. 5 people, members of a single family, were executed in cold blood. A young child was left wounded but alive among the bodies of their family members, surviving what would become one of the most notorious gang-related massacres in California during the 1990s. For investigators, it was almost incomprehensible. Home invasions were nothing new, but this level of brutality was rare, even among hardened gang units. The Nguyen murders sent shockwaves through the community, sparking fear, outrage, and intense pressure on law enforcement. Families in nearby neighborhoods stopped sleeping with their windows open. Parents who had never worried about gang crime began keeping their children indoors. The press ran headlines describing a massacre, and local officials promised swift justice. But as detectives desperately tried to assemble clues, they had no idea that the same group responsible for the killings was already preparing for their next strike. What made the spree so dangerous was that it didn't end with the Nguyen case. Chhoun and his associates continued moving north through California, searching for new targets. Their next fatal attack took place in Sacramento, a home invasion that would end with the murder of 2 men from the Lee family. This time, Chhoun and a close associate, Samrath Pan, were identified as the principal perpetrators. According to testimony and trial evidence, the attack was brutal and swift. The victims were killed during a robbery that prosecutors described as cold-blooded and unnecessary. It highlighted a pattern in Chhoun's actions. Violence was rarely used for necessity. It was used as domination. Anything that resembled resistance was met with lethal force. The Sacramento murders helped law enforcement begin connecting the dots. The similarities between the crimes, multiple offenders, an Asian gang connection, execution-style killings, signaled to investigators that this was not random violence. A group was responsible, and that group was moving. But the pace of the attacks made it difficult for detectives in different jurisdictions to coordinate before another tragedy struck. As if the Nguyen and Le family murders were not enough to ignite a statewide manhunt, Run and Pan committed a 3rd murder in Pomona. This killing was different from the home invasion robberies. According to case files, the victim was reportedly mistaken for a rival gang member. That misidentification cost an innocent person their life. In the world of gang warfare, where paranoia, revenge, and pride drive decisions, mistakes are not uncommon. But this killing demonstrated the recklessness of Run's spree. Violence had become not just a method, but a reflex. It didn't matter if the target was a rival, a stranger, or a family inside their home. Run and his associates struck without hesitation. In Pomona, the investigation took a sharper turn. Witnesses began cooperating. Community members who had heard whispers about TRG activity started contacting police. Detectives were able to gather evidence linking the killings together. And with that evidence came a clearer picture of the man leading the spree. Run wasn't just another gang member who had gone too far. He was organized, feared, and capable of influencing younger associates to follow him into extreme violence. His decisions were not impulsive. They were purposeful, driven by a need to maintain dominance within the gang and to create a legacy of fear. The spree represented an intersection of trauma, gang culture, and escalating criminal ambition. But it also exposed a profound truth about the consequences of unresolved violence. Each crime was more aggressive than the last, as though Run was testing how far he could push without consequences. But consequences were coming. California law enforcement across multiple counties, San Bernardino, Sacramento, and Los Angeles, began coordinating efforts. As detectives shared details, a clear pattern emerged and Run's name rose to the top of every suspect list. The spree lasted only weeks, but its impact was seismic. Families across the state grieved. Asian immigrant communities felt a double wound, victimized by someone from within their own community while simultaneously facing increased scrutiny. The Nguyen and Le family murders became symbols of the terrifying unpredictability of gang violence. The Pomona killing illustrated the danger of mistaken identity in a world defined by rivalry. And at the center of it all was Chhoun, a man shaped by genocide, hardened by the streets, and now responsible for 9 deaths in less than 2 months. By late 1995, the manhunt was underway. SWAT teams, gang units, and federal agents were alerted. The spree was over. The pursuit had begun. And the next chapter of Run's life would unfold, not in the streets of California, but in the courtroom, where he would face the full weight of the justice system he had long evaded. When the violence finally stopped, California law enforcement wasted no time in turning Chhoun from a name whispered in gang neighborhoods into the central figure of one of the state's most aggressive homicide investigations. The coordinated effort paid off. By late 1995, investigators had tied the Nguyen family murders, the Le family murders, and the Pomona killing directly to Run and his associates. The evidence, witness statements, forensic links, and the testimonies of co-defendants left little doubt that he had led a spree unlike anything the state had faced in years. For Run, the chaos of the streets was replaced by the cold structure of the criminal justice system, and the battle for his life began. The initial hearings drew significant media attention. Reporters described Run as emotionless, calm, and detached, traits that had followed him throughout his life. Prosecutors painted him as the mastermind of a series of executions that shocked even veteran detectives. They emphasized not just the death toll, 9 people murdered within weeks, but the nature of the killings. Families slaughtered in their homes, victims executed without hesitation, and an innocent man in Pomona gunned down because of mistaken identity. This wasn't random violence, they argued. It was calculated, merciless, and relentless. As the case progressed, the central question shifted from who committed the murders to how Run's mind had been shaped. Defense attorneys introduced the argument that would become a core theme of his legal fight for years to come: the psychological consequences of childhood trauma. They described a young boy forced into Khmer Rouge work camps, forced to watch executions before he was old enough to understand life or death. They argued that the violence Run witnessed in Cambodia created a permanent psychological fracture, making him emotionally stunted, impulsive, and unable to fully comprehend the moral weight of his actions. In essence, The defense claimed that the man who committed the murders was not created in America, but molded in one of the darkest chapters of human history. However, the prosecution countered with equal force. Trauma, they argued, does not excuse the deliberate execution of 9 people. Countless Cambodian refugees had lived through similar horrors without resorting to murder. More importantly, Run had demonstrated organization, leadership, and control throughout the spree, traits inconsistent with the portrait of a man acting under psychological immaturity. Prosecutors insisted he knew exactly what he was doing. The murders were not acts of impulse or the uncontrolled release of trauma. They were the conscious decisions of a gang leader, maintaining dominance through fear and violence. The turning point came in February 2002 when a Los Angeles Superior Court jury weighed the arguments. After hearing weeks of emotional testimony examining graphic evidence and listening to psychological experts on both sides, the jury reached a unanimous conclusion. Chhoun should be sentenced to death. The courtroom fell silent as the verdict was read. For the families of the victims, it was a long-awaited moment of justice. For Run, it marked the beginning of the next stage of his life, one defined not by freedom or leadership, but by isolation on death row. Run was transferred to San Quentin State Prison, home to California's death row for men. In the stark confines of the prison, his world narrowed to a cell, a schedule, and decades of legal appeals. But his case did not fade into obscurity. His attorneys continued to argue that his childhood trauma should have been given greater weight during sentencing. They claimed that being forced as a young boy to witness genocide fundamentally damaged his development, making the death penalty an unjust punishment. They also argued that he lacked the psychological maturity required to fully grasp the consequences of his actions.